Thank you everyone for being here. I'm just looking at the faces and your screens, and it's so nice that you've made time in your day. I think you're in for a real treat. I met David about 10 years ago. And so when I came on as executive director of the Garrison Institute, and they said, okay, who do you want as your first guest? I said, I want it to be David Germano, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So he's the executive director at the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. He teaches and researches Tibetan and Buddhist studies at UVA, like Bruce said, where he also established the Tibet Center and founded the Tibetan and Himalayan Library. He has lived for many years in Tibetan and Buddhist communities, including in Tibet, China, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. He is one of the co-leaders of the Student Flourishing Initiative, which is a three-way partnership at UVA, the University of Wisconsin, and Penn State University, as well as the lead organizer of an international research community of scholars and translators specializing in the Great Perfection tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. He received his BA from the Notre Dame University and PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And beyond all of these accolades, David is such a creative mind. I had the chance to go down to UVA when the Contemplative Sciences Center was still sort of seeding its essence, I think, in the various schools at UVA, and incredibly inspired by the way that David thinks, the way he brings sort of an ethical framework, a very, very deep knowledge, of course, of contemplative practices and studies into the way he thinks about action. And he's extremely engaged in the world while also having the deep contemplative practice. So it's a real model for, I think, how we hope to be in the world. How can we be deeply grounded, knowledgeable and fluent in these ancient practices and that sort of perennial wisdom, while being able to use some of the innovative technologies and access to scientific research that we have today at our fingertips in order to make the world a better place, in order to create social and ecological transformation. And so this is why, I love talking to David. I every time I get to talk to him, I am enriched, and I hope that you are as well. So welcome, David. And first, I just want to start off by inviting you to maybe to tell us, what are you excited about in kind of the next 3 to 5 years of your work? And if you could tell us a little bit more about where you are today and what you've been thinking about.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Karen. I didn't realize I was the first guest, so I feel particularly honored. And it's really great to have you here at the Garrison Institute after knowing you for such a long time, and also being at the Garrison Institute for many years and appreciating the work that they do and all the events that they support. I think what I'm most excited about right now is something that we're calling the Generative Contemplation Initiative. And I'll tell you what the idea is behind it, but I think what excites me is the possibility of working deeply with the world's contemplative legacy as it's enshrined in historical religions and other traditions of contemplative practice, but also thinking about creative approaches to the future and how those creative approaches to the future and that rootedness in the past can undergird transformative programs within educational environments. And so making that connection between the past and the future and theory and practice, and seeing how research and scholarship and deep contemplative understanding can undergird new applications to address compelling crises and problems that we face in the present. So the idea behind the Generative Contemplative Initiative is thinking about contemplation as a human capacity that's generative in character. In other words, rather than think about it in terms of this practice or that practice with its procedural instructions, thinking of it as a human capacity, the way that we think of language as a human capacity, that when you acquire fluency or literacy in a particular language, such as English or Tibetan or Sanskrit or French or whatever it might be, you have a generative capacity. You have the capacity to generate appropriate speech forms or appropriate written discourse, depending upon the context that you find yourself in. So a conversation I have right now with you is going to be very different from a conversation I have another hour with someone else. But if I have the capacity, the generative capacity for fluency in English, I can generate the right form of speech right on the spur of the moment. And so if we think of contemplation in that way, not so much as like this practice and that practice, but rather a generative capacity that can keep producing a broad variety of contemplative practices perpetually, as makes sense for different people and different times and different spaces and so forth, I think we end up in a very different space. And so the work that we're doing right now, and the work I'm looking forward to over the next five years, is asking, first of all, questions about the contemplative legacies that we inherit from the past. And this has to do with what are the lexicons of those contemplative traditions? What are their characteristic building blocks? And what are their grammars? How are those building blocks get put together to form contemplative practices as a whole, and varied over time, or varied according to different kinds of practitioners and students and so forth? And then thirdly, what are the communicative context in which those lexicons strung together in particular ways have meaning: spatial, temporal, philosophical, intellectual, somatic, social, etc. And so then the idea then is to build that out based upon a deep analysis and interpretation and understanding of specific contemplative traditions. And then we're creating a design process that is itself contemplative in character, but also uses those lexicons and grammars and context as a kind of toolkit for the design process, so that if people come to us and say, hey, we're in an HR firm in a corporation, we're in a clinic for a hospital, we're in an elementary school classroom, and we would like to design contemplative interventions or contemplative practices that make sense for our stakeholders in our context, that we can go through that design process, draw upon the legacy of the past, but not translate it, not adapt it, not secularize it, but simply draw upon that fluency, that generative capacity to generate new contextually appropriate forms of contemplation that make sense in this space and this time and for these people and so forth. And so it's really a big collaboration between scholars and humanists, between scientists, between contemplative teachers, contemplative practitioners, design thinkers, and then a whole range of practitioners in the specific area that we're working in, whether it's environmental humanities, or whether it's education, or whether it's a pain clinic, or whatever it might be. So that really excites me, and in particular for us, as someone who's at University of Higher Education, the University of Virginia, my interest in particular is how can we establish that as the basis for the programs that we create and sustain at the University of Virginia to help support students during a time of unprecedented pressures. How do we support faculty implementing these kinds of things in academic classes, or working with student affairs professionals to do it in co-curricular activities or extracurricular activities or residential life and so forth? And so kind of closing that circle where the research and the scholarship and these kind of deep dives into the world's past with an eye towards design innovation in the future, how to connect that to this very applied work we do at transforming the possibilities of higher education during a time when students are so desperately in need of additional resources to confront the crisis at hand.
That's amazing. So now we want to maybe to provide some concrete examples, and your constituency, as you said, are young people, and then perhaps faculty and parents and partners. First, if you could talk a little bit about, we'll talk about that context before we move to organizations generally, but if you could talk a little bit about what that might look like. So an example inside the University of Virginia, and if you could explain, as you have so much kind of the visceral experience of what's happening with students these days, and looking at that constituency and kind of understanding the present reality that they're dealing with, and how that then leads you to design specific interventions or programs or what have you.
So usually when we think about higher education, we talk about three circles of student engagement: curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular. So curricular are the academic classes, the classes in economics, religious studies, Spanish, etc. Co-curricular are more structured kinds of programs that happen outside of the academic context. So you don't get credit, but you might do a day-long workshop or an 8-part series over 2 months or something. And then extracurricular is more unstructured kinds of opportunities where people are doing stuff like dances and other kinds of activities, outdoor activities and so forth. So we've been trying to think about how to help implement programs in each one of these 3 areas that has a deep contemplative basis. So I'll start with academic classes and just give you 2 concrete examples, one of which I wasn't personally involved with and one of which I was very personally involved with. So the first one would be Spanish. So Spanish is the dominant foreign language taught in, it's taught as a foreign language, or an additional language besides English in higher education in North America or in the United States. And Spanish classes have, the people responsible for this teaching of Spanish at the University of Virginia came to us with a problem, the problem being that anxiety amongst first-year and second-year students was interfering with their capacity to learn the language. And so because they were so anxious about their performance and their capacity to speak the language and so forth, it had become in many cases debilitating. And so they wanted to think about what they might do to mitigate that. And so our staff worked together with those faculty at thinking about how to introduce some just very simple practices to help the undergraduates learn how to downregulate, how to kind of manage their anxiety a little bit, and get into a more receptive space where they were able to actually perform up to their own abilities. And so that's a very concrete, small example, but an example that isn't something you would necessarily think like, oh, that's a contemplative class, it's just Spanish 101. And yet there was a very specific problem that they were experiencing and ways in which some simple contemplative practices could help them address those challenges and empower students to perform at in their best versions of themselves. A more expansive kind of challenge is large lecture classes. I have spent my entire professional life at the University of Virginia teaching large lecture courses. I think the last time I taught less than 60 students was in 1996 at the undergraduate level. And the vast majority of those classes were 200 and above. So, and research studies typically show us that large lecture classes are not exactly the most productive for learning, nor are they very productive in terms of helping students acquire skills and connections and so forth that buttress their well-being and personal development overall, which isn't to say that there can't be great lectures and certain students might find them very compelling. And so when we started this work, I had it in mind, like, I don't want to teach lecture classes anymore, but I still want to teach 200 people, 250 people, because that's essential for the model that we have in a place like the University of Virginia. It's how we fund our graduate students who act as teaching assistantships. It's how we have an economy of scale given our financial resources. And so I joined forces with Rob Roser at the Penn State University, John Dunn at University of Wisconsin, and a whole range of other people at the University of Virginia, as well as those 2 institutions, to think about how could we design a course called the Art and Science of Human Flourishing that could actually embody an approach that could be scaled up to 200 or 300 undergraduate students, and yet not simply be a lecture course. So the topic was about human flourishing, but it was really the methodology that was the more important thing. And so some of the concrete ways that we approach this is, first of all, we decided that every week we would have specific practices that the students would learn in the context of the large gathering, would do together to have that experience of being done together. And then they would have a smaller opportunity within the discussion sections where 20 students at a time would meet with graduate students to do the practice together in a smaller setting, as well as share their experiences and ask questions. And so these practices had very specific kinds of outcomes, whether it was about focusing the attention or developing empathy for others or reducing your bias or building resiliency up and so forth. And so one strand of the class then was to name these practices to help the students experience them, teach them, share their experiences, experience them in group settings, but also think about how that how those experiences and capacities that were being generated by the practices were related to the intellectual subject matter they were studying. So they were studying about resiliency from a scientific perspective or a humanistic perspective or an artistic perspective. And simultaneously, they were doing practices about resiliency, or we were studying attention and how attention works. And they were studying practices for how to focus the attention or to open the attention. Or we were studying about empathy and compassion and the difference between the two, and then actually doing practices to help them generate compassion for people that they have antagonistic relationships to or positive relationships to, and so forth. And then another part of that class was in the classroom itself. It wasn't simply about doing practices together. There were small moments of lecture, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. There were the group practices. And then there were also the opportunity to have a deeply contemplative connection between the subject matter of the course and their own lives. And so we would put them through a series of exercises where they would take the intellectual subject matter that we were studying in the form of articles and books and so forth, and to connect this to questioning about their own lives, their own past, their own experiences in the present, their hopes for the future, and so forth. And they would go through a series of exercises where they would have to fill something out, making these connections, and then they would go through a kind of contemplative listening process with another or two other students to essentially have a kind of peer-to-peer exchange. And so to wind that up, the way in which the course was stitched together was practices, these experiential exercises that connected the intellectual subject matter with the matter of their lives, the opportunity to share the results of those reflections with other students, and then small moments of lecture that helped guide them through the intellectual subject matter at hand. And so the idea was a deeply contemplative interweaving of practices, experiences, exchanges, and intellectual subject matter. So if we're looking at resiliency, all of those were galvanized around resiliency or courage or compassion or focus and so forth. So those are two concrete examples of what it might look like in an academic context.
Yeah, I think so. I hope everyone in our audience is thinking about, and I'm going to invite you to put questions in the chat and that we'll hopefully get to before the end around, when you hear what David was talking about, and I'm imagining, okay, this in a bank, in a in a manufacturing context, whatever, in your organizational context, imagining if everyone, instead of as David has said, bringing sort of, you have an instruction manual, oh, do these breathing practices, and then you just have your meetings as usual, and there's conflict, and it's people are asked to just stay in their roles and not necessarily invited to flourish as their full human selves, but instead think about what it would mean if all of these students that David is working with, they graduate and they go out into the world and they're bringing this contemplative, generative fluency into the organizational context in which they operate and what that might mean. So just to invite you to start thinking about what this might mean in your own contexts. And so David, I wanted to ask you about so getting to this level of fluency with contemplative practices where you can, in a moment say, this is the context in which I'm about to enter, and I want to have influence and sort of enable this flourishing. How much do people really need to understand in terms of the knowledge base, the level of practice that they need to have in order to be able to generate this kind of fluency in their own context?
Well, so a couple of different responses to that. Like, first of all, part of the goal in terms of the framework, the generative contemplation framework, in terms of thinking about contemplative practices in Tibetan Buddhism, which is what I really know about, but you can also do it with regards to Judaism or Sufism or whatever it might be. But part of the goal is to help open up those practices in a more radical way, because we all live extremely busy lives these days, and our different fields of expertise are increasingly vertical in character, so that it becomes a really intense task to master what we need to do to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or whatever it might be, computer scientist. And we don't have the time and energy to learn Tibetan or learn Arabic and do a deep dive and spend years in these communities and so forth. And so part of the goal is to try to open up these practices, not simply like, here's how you do it, 1, 2, 3, but to kind of go below that level to here's how these practices are generated and varied over time, to try to help people feel enabled and empowered to have that level of understanding. I think sometimes the way that we approach contemplative practices in a culture where it's not something we can take for granted as part of our childhood and our upbringing and the medium in which we live, we tend to look at it in a very formalistic way. And if you think about it in terms of language, it's almost like we see, oh, that's an interesting speech, I'll memorize it. Or that's an interesting poem, I'll memorize it. As opposed to like teaching English as a second language, where you don't tell them memorize a speech, memorize a poem. You teach them underlying principles. You help them understand how speech can be endlessly varied and writing can be endlessly varied. So I'm interested in trying to work with others, contemplative teachers and scholars and scientists and so forth, to help open up those deep contemplative practices to others, to have a sense of how do these practices get generated in the first place, and why can one practice have literally 100 different forms or variations? What's the allowable variation? What's the not allowable variation within this tradition? So having those kinds of resources, in my mind, is to try to enable someone who perhaps is a doctor, or someone who's works in an HR firm in a corporation, who works in a clinic, who's an elementary school teacher, who doesn't have the time and energy to spend years of their life engaging in that kind of mastery. But if those materials were opened up to them in this way, they could potentially see their ways through this in a way that otherwise is impossible. Now, I see there being two contrasting directions here in terms of the depth of contemplation that someone requires, or the depth of contemplation someone is engaged with. On the one level, I really would like to see these opened up in a radical way. I would like to see contemplation as something that people feel empowered to have a playful, a curious, experimental, exploratory relationship with. I would like to see an undergraduate class where it's not just like, oh, here's the professor and he or she or they have all this expertise and knowledge, and all we can do is kind of understand their instructions and try to do our best to replicate them. Instead, what if that class was a place where we learn some basics, but they're also learning to trust their own instincts, and they're learning to be exploratory and experimental and to vary stuff and so forth. So that's one kind of instinct I have, or impetus. And the second one is to have pathways where there is something about expertise. There is something about people who've spent years and years of their life engaged in retreats and deep contemplative practices, and who have actually spent a lot of time teaching people and training other teachers and so forth. And so in addition to that kind of extremely accessible, exploratory environment that encourages playfulness and curiosity and variability and adaptiveness, also having a kind of pathway where people can go from there, or go from relatively simple kinds of exposures to increasingly be able to access deeper forms of experience and practice with people who do have the competence. So the answer to your question would be, it depends upon the context. I think it's fine for people who have a very limited contemplative background, but they're deeply open to it and committed to exploring it, to work with others in that environment. But if you're going down a pathway towards deeper and deeper opportunities, then I think people need deeper and deeper forms of expertise and experience to actually act responsibly as mentors.
Beautiful. Yeah. So we have a question I want to ask in a moment, but one thing we have talked about is also the design of physical spaces that enable this sort of cultural transformation through a contemplative mindset. And I found it very interesting to hear a little bit about the space, the building that you're designing at University of Virginia. And I think this is relevant for so many people in the workplace, because as leaders are having to now, they're trying to draw people back into the physical workspace, or figure out how to do the hybrid. And what does it mean to come back together? So how do you create, or how do you think about creating an inviting environment that is infused with sort of the contemplative mindset?
Well, at the University of Virginia, the built environment and architecture is never far from one's mind. It's one of only two universities in the world that's a World Heritage Site. And behind me, you see the original campus, which at the University of Virginia, we don't call it campus, we call it the grounds, which was designed by Thomas Jefferson and built and executed by enslaved laborers for the most part. And behind me, you see the rotunda, which is the building that originally housed some of the classes and libraries and so forth. It's a building where all the rooms are round or oval. There's no sharp corners. And then that anchors this long lawn that stretches out, in the other direction. And you see just behind my shoulder, what's called a pavilion. So there's these pavilions where each of the faculty from 10 different disciplines would live. And between each pavilions were the one-story residences where students would live. And so that original campus was what was designed in the early part of the 19th century by Thomas Jefferson and remains to this date. And it reflects a kind of vision of the built environment and knowledge. And it's very, what they call in architecture, biophilic in design. It has extensive incorporation of gardens. There's double gardens, upper garden and lower garden behind each one of those pavilions. It also reflects integration. The entire campus could be walked on the second story. You could walk across the entire campus on the second story, with the idea being that he wanted to build bridges of integration between the different areas of knowledge represented by the pavilion would be history, this pavilion would be literature, etc. So with those things in mind, we had an opportunity because of a generosity of a series of donors, with a lead gift from Paul and Sonia Jones and generous gifts from a number of other donors, to design a building where the only rationale was to think about what does the built environment look like at a university if you design it for the flourishing and deep states of well-being of young people with a contemplative orientation. And so from day one, that was our overarching question. And we went through a design process to think about, how do we do that? How do we take the inspiration from the past that we see here behind me? This is an event called the Meditation on the Lawn, which Deepak Chopra is that little guy on the steps there who's leading the meditation for gathered students and faculty and staff and community members we did about, 7 or 8 years ago. So, and what we came up with is a building that will be finished by the end of this year. It's called the Contemplative Commons, 60,000 square foot building. And we integrated a number of these design principles from the past with new innovations from the present. And so one of the things that we did is that we designed every room to be by default empty, completely empty. This is a completely radical notion for an academic building in a university. When you walk in academic buildings, you'll see that every room is full. It's full of stuff. It's full of tablets and chairs and tables, or it's a tiered auditorium with bolted chairs that all face the front and so forth. Like, the stuff that dominates these rooms basically tells you this is the nature of learning. You're going to be constrained here. We're announcing to you the kinds of learning that can happen. One person can talk at 300 people. 20 people can sit around a long table and talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera. So we came up with the notion of, let's get rid of all the furniture. Let's make it completely empty. Now, of course, you're probably thinking, well, that's crazy, but here's how we did it. I was in an intramural and recreational space at the University of Virginia in one of their studios, and I realized the way that they did it is they designed hidden storage space with every single studio. So every mat, every cushion, everything you need to use in those intramural recreational sport activities comes out of there and goes back in there. So the space is by default empty. So we designed the building so that every single space, including the largest flat floor academic space at the University of Virginia, every single space has hidden storage space where every chair, every table, every cushion, every mat can fit into, which means that you can configure the space in a way that makes sense for the lived activity that you're going to do in that space. You want to do a dance, you want to sit around quietly, you want to do yoga, you want to do a class that oscillates between lectures and intense conversations and dialogues with seated practice. You can do all of that because the space is not dictating the form of activity that has to take place within it. So that very simple design principle. Other design principles are we integrated nature at every level, because we wanted students to bolster their resiliency through a systemic connection to the natural environment. I was inspired by the High Line in New York City. So we built a living bridge along the third floor of the building. We built an interior third floor garden. We built a courtyard of living trees. It nestles a deep water pond that has an extensive garden behind it and so forth. There's extensive glass and natural materials, brick, wood, stone, and so forth. So that that's a key part. Two other key parts are we used wood floor. I wanted floors that were friendly to human bodies. Wood floors are forbidden in academic spaces because they're not durable. But then you get these floors that are not supportive of a human body, which kind of tells you, hey, don't use your human body here. This is a mind thing. Well, we want a place where the mind and the body, emotions, they're all being brought and welcomed. And so we got a dispensation to create wood floors throughout every single academic space. We also got dispensation to create individuated temperature controls, another problem in academic buildings where the temperature control is central. Well, I'm in a space where I'm doing a lot of physical activity. They're in a space where they're quietly sitting doing something. But those temperatures are going to need to be totally different in character. And then the final thing we did in the building is, I know this would set some people in the contemplative world a little bit on edge, but I didn't want the building to be an environment that was at odds with technology. Because I think one of the main culprits we have with young people's well-being is attentional toxicity. And this has to do with what's called surveillance capitalism, where big companies are commodifying our kids' attention and manipulating it to make them tractable, reliable commodities on the market. Social media that we all know about, undermining of focused attention by smartphones, et cetera. So I'm perfectly acutely aware of how disastrous digital technology has been for our young people. But in addition to mitigation strategies, digital hygiene, digital moderation, et cetera, I'm also interested in the transformative possibilities of digital technology. How can we take digital technology and help kids understand the way that it could be harnessed towards transformative goals, towards creating environments of playfulness, whimsy, awe, et cetera. And so one of the things we have in the building is we have 4 different spaces that represent the intersection of technology, the arts, and contemplation in ways that can be harnessed towards helping facilitate the flourishing of young people. And so I'll just give you one example, then I'll stop talking about this and turn it back over to you, Karen. One example is Wolfgang Buttress, a very famous British artist who does technologically informed ecological art installations. And so what he has done is, the building is a courtyard building that on the open end nestles a deep water pond that we call the Dell Pond. And so he created 3-dimensional images of the flora and fauna of that pond, and then he etched them as 3-dimensional images in glass blocks. And then a room in the first floor has those glass blocks constitute the wall of the room. And then he's put a series of sensors, environmental sensors, into the pond to sense the movement of fish, the aquatic life, the humidity level, the water level, et cetera. And that data gets fed back into that room in real time, and a series of algorithms transforms it into a series of changing lightscapes and soundscapes using musical compositions as well as field recordings from the local ecology. And so the idea is that the room itself becomes a place where technology helps mediate a profound contemplation on the nature of water, the water that we carry within our bodies, the water in the air, the water in the environment around us. And so that's just a small example of how we're trying to see the building as a place where it's not just contemplation removed from everything else, it's contemplation, it's the arts, it's technology, intersecting in ways that people can intentionally follow pathways towards greater flourishing in their lives and in their communities, and ideally, and hopefully in the more than human world in which we are embedded.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I think that, imagine, if our workplaces were this thoughtful and thinking about our whole selves. I know we recently had an art installation at the Institute. It was many, I don't know how many tons of dirt in a room where it kind of carved out in a figure of a human body, and then there were these sounds of breathing and a soundscape of like the moon, etc., and the ocean playing. And so after a whole day of meetings, I could go lay down in the dirt and just be immersed in this soundscape. And there was nothing more rejuvenating. And get up after, 8 minutes, 12 minutes of that, of being in this exhibit, and I was ready to go again. And I just think the ways that you're thinking about these spaces is genius. There's a question from Ms. Participant. Could you walk us through doing a contemplative practice within the structure of a workplace workday?
You mean like in an office? Like
Yeah,
how you might.
yeah, I mean, I think, for example, if let's say it's a team meeting, and
Right.
how might a team meeting become a space for this sort of generative
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that I'm going to go back to the whole issue of being curious and playful and experimental and so forth, because I think sometimes in the contemplative world or the well-being world, like we can sometimes settle into ways of doing things that we just do over and over and over. Like, for example, the check-in, where people go around and just circle and just check in, like, oh, here's how I'm doing and so forth, and you check out and so forth. And I would like to see, and I'm not saying that I've done this great myself, so this is something that I am thinking about a lot and so forth, is just taking a more playful, whimsical, sometimes very serious kind of approach to those that's creative, that's changing in character. So, but okay, I'm going to pull back one moment and just tell you like how I think about Tibetan Buddhist practices from a grammatical point of view, and then extending that to this particular context. I think of, when I look at Tibetan Buddhist practices, which is the one thing I know in life really well in this, I do a lot of stuff I know not so well, but Tibetan Buddhist stuff I've studied for all my whole adult life. And when I look at the way that they execute practices and the way they theorize and model practices, I see it as a fivefold structure. And this is pretty explicit in the Tibetan tradition. First of all, you have preparation. You prepare for stuff. Like you find the place, if you need some kind of equipment, you get those together. It's just like logistical preparations. And then the second part is when the session starts. You have a preliminary phase. And there are particular things you do then. You might make offerings to the local land spirits. You might accumulate merit and wisdom. You might declare your intentions. You might orient yourself towards the Buddha or whatever it is. And then the third phase is the actual practice, the main part of the practice, whatever it might be, whether it's a visualization, a focus, a body interior practice, whatever it is, you do the major practice. And then the fourth of these 5 phases is the conclusion, is when you bring it to a wrap. And there's again a series of things you typically do. You dissolve whatever you were doing. You often will sit quietly in silence or quiet. You may dedicate the merit to other living beings or your community. And you may also think about, how do I want to take the experiences I just had and bring them back into my life? And then the 5th and final part is your life. It's outside of the meditative session. It's reminding yourself throughout the day what I experienced, what I committed to bringing into my life, and just trying to make those connections, even though you're, of course, in the middle of a lot of transactional busyness and potentially difficult circumstances and so forth. So with that in mind, let's think about the meeting in that way, as having those 5 phases. Like, that's not usually how we do meetings. And this is like me. I mean, like when I first started this work at the Contemplative Science Center 11 years ago, super busy person, working like absurd toxic levels, like 70 to 100 hours a week in work, just very typical for people who do the kind of work I was doing, which was a lot of kind of nonprofit oriented work in Asia for communities in need. And when I approached a meeting, it was not like that at all. It was like, let's go. Okay, we got 30 minutes. Let's do it. Bang, 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 bang. And I needed so much efficiency out of those meetings because I knew I had like 55 more meetings before the end of the day and so forth, or it was late at night or early in the morning and so forth. So that's not the contemplative approach at all. And it may be super efficient if everybody signed on to it, but it's kind of brutal for the people as individuals, that may be the place where they're connecting to each other, and they may have all sorts of things they're bringing to that meeting today. So if we think of the meeting in a contemplative way, it first of all just means it's much more intentional. And the intentionality is not simply in what we need to process and what we need to get out of this in terms of outcomes. It's an intentionality that thinks about who's at this meeting, why are they here, how can we best structure this process, how can it have an outcome that isn't simply about the transactional outcome, but also has an outcome that's positive for people as individuals and positive for this team as a team and so forth, and bolstering their flourishing. So how do we prepare for it? Do we need some kind of props or materials? Like actually thinking in advance, what will we do? How will we start the meeting? How will we punctuate the meeting? How will we bring the meeting to an end? And then when we think about that preliminary and concluding parts of a meditative session, have the meeting be that way. It doesn't have to be a check-in or a checkout. It can be many different things, but start the meeting in a very intentional way to say, now this meeting starts. Now for the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 60 minutes, we are together. We have a container here. And we're marking that commitment, that moment of transition. We're not just saying, okay, let's go. Who's got the first point? Instead, we mark the fact that we have started a contemplative session. And at the end, we do the same thing. We don't say, okay, we got to go, let's run, or whatever. You mark it formally, just the same way you bring a meditative session to a conclusion. And you can bring a lot of those elements from contemplative practices into this. You can think about, how do we want to start it in a way that maybe is reflective of getting people in the right disposition. Maybe it's a playful start to just get people a little bit relaxed and, like they're very focused. Let's make them a little less focused so they're more open to different perspectives and more open to each other's suggestions and so forth. Some kind of maybe playful activity at the start. At the end, maybe we want to have something that is really a formal conclusion that says, what is your takeaway from this activity? Like, what are you going to do next? Just a very simple thing, not just like, how are you doing today, but like, really, what's your takeaway from today? Everybody just go around really quickly. And in the context of the meeting itself, again, to just think in structured ways, like, how do we want this meeting to pursue? Maybe in the middle of the meeting, you do want to, you can't do this all the time because otherwise we are busy people and there's a lot of meetings in life. But maybe for a very special meeting, you do want to bring some formal contemplative practice into the meeting that is pertinent to what you're trying to achieve. It might be pertinent to just the fact that your team has a lot of tension with each other right now. And so you want to do a simple practice on empathy and perspective taking to just get them in that mindset that, oh man, I need to not be focused on how mad I am at that person over there, but to have a little bit of perspective on the fact that they're experiencing similar things that I'm experiencing. There are things they're unhappy about. There are things they're happy about. They want to embrace pleasure and avoid pain and so forth. So, or it could be that there's a very simple contemplative practice to insert in the middle that is pertinent to the subject matter being talked about to help people penetrate that. Or maybe there is none. And yet somehow still, when you're thinking about the process of how people are engaged with each other, that again, there's an intentionality to it, whether you want to make sure every voice is heard, or you want to make sure that you're going in a structured way through a series of topics and so forth. So I'll give you another example that I've done a lot of. The team meetings, I am no great professional at. I think that's something where I'm very much a kind of learner, because I still do have a strong tendency to want to just run the meeting and get a goal accomplished and move on. One thing I've done a lot of over the last 10 years is contemplative dinners. And that was something very new for me because I had descended into the Gen Z reality of just, dinners, like there's never dinners. There's not dinners like when I grew up where you had a dinner was like a meditative session. It started and it stopped when dad said it started and stopped. That was my Italian father's way of running dinners. But over time, my dinners just totally collapsed. So everybody just ate wherever they ate. There was nothing formal about it, no beginning and end. So Jeff Walker, who's the head of our advisory board at the CSC, introduced this idea of dinners that for him were inspired by Thomas Jefferson and how he supposedly ran dinners at his home in Monticello. But for me, I began to think of them really as contemplative dinners. And the idea was that the dinners had a beginning, they had a middle, they had an end, and they were deeply reflective and contemplative. And so the beginning started with, you said, this is a whole table dinner. So for the next 2 hours, nobody can talk to the person next to them. Every comment has to be done to the table, to the group. The group has to be the primary entity. And you start off with a provocative question. a question that's deeply reflective, that requires people to make a personal disclosure as well as an intellectual kind of reflection. And you start the dinner by going around, and each person has to respond to that question in a way that's personal as well as intellectual. And then you segue into this whole table conversation where you really constantly ensure that every voice is being heard. And then you end the dinner with going around the table again in a more rapid fashion to ask people for one thing they want to take away from this and ponder further and maybe follow up in the fabric of their life. It sounds very simple, but it really transforms the nature of how we experience dining. And I've done a lot of those in the professional context.
Yeah, I think, and we know, breaking bread with people, it already sort of even neurologically, it helps us to feel more of a kinship, and then it's a more comfortable setting in which to try out some of these practices. So we have a bunch of questions, and one of them I'm kind of going according to theme. So Stephen Madenberg asked, how might you help an executive leadership team begin to see contemplative practices as fully aligned with a high performance organization? My experience with such audiences is that they might barely tolerate such practices.
Yeah, well, I'm a great person for that question because that's me. So that's my bias. And I have to say, over the last 10 years, I have struggled often with exactly that kind of sentiment, where I'm just like, hey, I love contemplative traditions and practices, but right now, can we just do the meeting? Let's just go forward. And so it's been a learning process for me to kind of understand the value or the problematic character of doing that and the value for doing it otherwise. I think that there's a couple of approaches to that. One is that it's really important to be individualized, in my opinion. I think what really grates on people's nerves is when someone comes in and says, here's how we have to do this. And they have this very formalized way of thinking about how you're going to start the meeting, how you're going to end the meeting. And it's the same every time. It has nothing to do with this group or this group's reality or what's going on in the world around them and so forth. And I think that can just be grating on people. So I also think it's important to begin light and kind of work gradually. I certainly wouldn't start with a group like that by doing some really complicated meeting structure. But even if it's as simple as like, let's start by just having like a 15-second start and a 15-second end to just formally mark the boundaries of this meeting. And then you can just gradually begin to let people see, well, is it different? Does it feel different at all to have a meeting that starts with 15 seconds of just taking a couple of deep breaths and ending that way? And if they do, maybe we could go a little bit farther than that and do something else and so forth. I also think it's critical that there's someone who has credibility within that team who can internalize that approach and be the person to really speak for it. Otherwise, I think if it's just purely someone from outside who comes in and says, oh, here's how we should do this and so forth, and there's not someone who has credibility within the team has internalized those values and is kind of speaking up for it, then I think that can be problematic too. It's just easy to kind of other that person and think, well, that's not what we do and so forth. But if someone's there to kind of be the person to say, this has value, then I think people can hear that. So it's just a process. I mean, I think also if there's people from above who have indicated, hey, this is something important for our culture. It's not just like an isolated thing from this one group. That can be really meaningful as well. But like I said, for me, it has been a process to kind of come to see the value of thinking about. And I think for the dinner is really where the most compelling thing for me, because then I saw like, well, there's an art to having a dinner and there's an art to having a meeting. Mm-hmm. And if I think contemplation and being reflective and hearing people's voices and welcoming life into processes are productive, then that should also be true in meetings as well. So, making an intellectual argument as well, like citing literature, showing people concrete examples, etc.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I've done a lot of team coaching in the corporate setting myself, and one of the most compelling things that we've done is in working with teams, and we develop these practices and often calling it critical reflection, but it's basically contemplative practice for the workplace. And then when the executives see how incredibly innovative those teams are that have been through that process, and especially how they are leveraging the diverse perspectives on the team, because often if you're just ramming through your agenda, diverse voices will, of all kinds, neurodiversity, interdisciplinary, ethnic, racial, et cetera, get shut down. I've seen that happen often. And so by opening that up, taking the time to actually care for the team through these practices, innovation just flourishes. And then the executives are like, what was different? What happened? What did this team do differently? So I think there's so much there. Okay, there's a bunch of other questions.
Let me address the issue of,
sure.
I saw the question just about transforming individuals versus groups. And I'll just say how I've thought about that, because I'm a very, I think I grew up as a very kind of solitary person in a way. I spent my 20s all in Tibet in religious communities and studying Buddhism and so forth. And I very much had to focus on like my individual transformation, my suffering, my insights, my ability to resiliently navigate this world, and all these practices I wanted to learn and do and so forth. And I think one of the most fundamental adult lessons that I had was, and I'll just say it in a kind of very flat way, which is we don't transform as individuals. We transform as communities. And that's always true. Even when it feels like I'm transforming individually, I'm doing these practices, but we're always entangled with others. And if we don't change the nature of the organizational context in which we work, it is fool's gold to think that we're going to transform the individuals. Like, yes, we do need individuals to have supportive pathways for pursuing their own individual goals and so forth. But in the end of the day, I think our ultimate goal is to transform organizations and communities, and through those cultures, which can be supportive environments for others to learn and to grow. I mean, I remember when we started this work in elementary schools in Louisville, Kentucky. It's called the Compassionate Schools Project, which has another URL, compassionateschoolsproject.org. One of the largest randomized control trials done on contemplative interventions in elementary school education. I remember just going to those classrooms and looking at those kids in these public school systems in Louisville and thinking, you know who determines these kids' futures? We do. The kids don't determine it. And I'm not saying that individual kids won't screw up the greatest of opportunities or maximize their lives in the most difficult of constraints, but as a whole, as a collective, the choices that we make in terms of the investments we make or not make in those educational environments, and the nature of those investments and the curriculums that we set up and the teacher training and support that we give, that will determine the future of those kids as a whole, period. And so that's just reflects my kind of level of commitment to thinking about transformation at the collective level.
Yeah, that's so I'm sorry, I'm going to try to keep going with the questions because there's a whole conversation about that. It's such a huge topic of individual versus collective. And I think people do think it has to be individual transformation, multiplied by 7 billion. Cecile, who is the board chair of the Middle Way School of Buddhist Elementary School in Hudson Valley, had a question, and she wanted to know a little bit more about the Compassionate Schools Project, how you've integrated contemplative practices for students, teachers, and parents, and how that impacted the community.
So the Compassionate Schools Project was, it still is, but it was like a 8-year process. It's a very large randomized control trial involving 20,000 students and so forth. And so we had to be careful because the intervention we were doing was in tandem with this big research program. And so we weren't free to just do whatever we wanted to do and so on. So the focus was on, we created a curriculum. It's a very large curriculum. Tish Jennings and Alexis Harris are the 2 co-authors of it, along with a number of other people who contributed. And the curriculum integrates 4 different approaches. One is alternatives to physical education. So looking at physical education in terms of flexibility, movements, poses, somatic awareness, etc. That was one strand. The second strand was attentional regulation, tools for these kids to learn how to downregulate when they needed to downregulate, to focus when they needed to focus, to open their awareness. So simple kind of mindfulness and other kinds of contemplative practices that are age appropriate for those kids. Number 3, social emotional learning, very traditionally well-established thing. And number 4, some basic dietary education. And the idea was the curriculum completely integrates with each other. So when you're learning about awareness directed to your body, you're connecting it up to dietary education, you're connecting it up to how certain social emotional situations make you feel, and so forth. So it's not 4 different components, it's 4 different strands of a single whole. So that was for the kids, but of course you can do everything you want with the kids, but my kind of point about it being collective is if the teachers are suffering and the teachers are miserable and the teachers aren't compassionate and contemplative and stress resilient and so forth, they're just going to devastate whatever you do at the curricular level. And so you need to provide a lot of support to teachers. And so we used Tish Jennings' CARE system and also Alexis Harris's CALM system, which are 2 deeply contemplative teacher professional development programs or support programs. So we implemented that as well in Louisville as a support for the teachers, both people who were teaching our curriculum as well as teachers who weren't teaching our curriculum. And there were other things to do with parents and so forth, but that wasn't really the primary thrust of the project as it was conceived during the research part of it. So I think that was the question, maybe.
Yeah, great. So we only just have a couple minutes. And so I wonder, David, if you want to just leave us with a few thoughts about, how you're seeing the future, sort of your own work, but also the work of organizations and society as places where communities gather, where transformation can happen.
Well, for me, I'm in higher education. I have done a lot of work in other sectors in Asia, but higher education has been my persistent home. And for the last 11 years, that's been my focus on thinking about higher education. And we're all in different sectors and professionally and communally and so forth. And, I think two thoughts. One is that when we started that work in the Compassionate Schools Project in Louisville, I remember I had this really strong kind of insight at one point, not any earth-shattering insight, but I thought, like, it's great for these kids to learn these skills, basic somatic awareness, kindness, gratitude, ability to regulate their attention, ability to focus their attention. These are great. They're not going to solve the world's problems. They're not going to solve these kids' problems. They're going to be contributing to their capacity to be resilient and caring and so forth. But in the end, it's a much more complex problem that we face in society with school systems and communities and so forth. And that's a much bigger venture. And so when I think about my own area of higher education, and I think for each of us in our own different places, we have to ask the question, what are the goals of this community? I mean, you have to love the context that you're working with to understand their point of view. How are they suffering? What are their realities? What are their goals? What are their starting points? And then how can you bring something called contemplation to bear to those? And so really quickly, in the context of higher education, for me, it's about young people. And young people are suffering tremendously. And their suffering and the deterioration of their well-being is escalating in an exponential fashion. There's nothing positive you can say about it, really. And so when we look at higher education, my question is, if they're changing at that rapid a pace, shouldn't we be changing at the same rapid a pace to try to adjust our environmental realities and curriculum and residential life and so forth to try to address this? But if we want to address that, we have to understand it. What are driving these realities? What have changed materially about these kids' environment that are producing these implosions of well-being that we're seeing comparing to 30, 40, 50 years ago? And once we have that analysis, then we can begin to think about how can we design solutions that take that reality in mind. And I think the challenges are attentional toxicity, disconnection from each other, from communities, from the environment, and also overwhelming pace, rapidity, complexity of change that's outstripping their capacity to be resiliently navigating it. So how do we help them build those resources for attentional restoration, resources for reconnecting with each other in the world, resources for developing self-efficacy and the capacity to resiliently navigate changes which are only going to accelerate in character? And how do we do that in our context? How do we design academic classes? How do we design co-curricular, extracurricular activities, the built environment, the residential life? So that's my thought process. And I think all of us have to go through the same thought process in our particular sector. The realities, the goals, and how we can design solutions to take those things into account.
Oh, yes, I think that's a call to action. I mean, if we all think about how deeply and expansively, David is thinking about the constituents that he serves and how he can help transform their experience, which is currently not so great, then I think if we all can think a little bit about how might we leverage these practices that are thousands of years old, and adapt them for the environments that we are quickly responding to, and then they're changing and they're evolving. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that the Garrison Institute is having an event to mark our 20th anniversary in November called Metamorphosis, and it's very much around this theme of the environment. When a member of the species changes in the metamorphosis and the natural sciences way, it's because of changes in the environment. It's often temperature. Recent research around this says temperature changes, and then species kind of go inward in a chrysalis or what have you, and then change form. And so we're talking about this theme of metamorphosis around what does this mean for human beings? We need to respond to our rapidly changing environment. And so the kind of expansive ways and creative ways that David is thinking about his context, I think is really inspiring for how we can all be thinking about how do we need to change and how do we need to go inward in order to make that change make sense, true sense for the realities that we're facing. So thank you, David, so much. This was really, really fascinating, even exceeded my expectations. And there are actually a bunch of questions that we didn't get to answer. So hopefully we'll have you back at some point and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Karen. I'm so happy to be the champagne bottle on the bow of your new ship. So I'm honored. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please feel free to email me, germano@virginia.edu, if you have any questions or follow-up and so forth. But thank you all so much for joining us.